I was doing some trial and error testing for another video and I stumbled onto the issue that is the topic of this video. I should say re-stumbled onto. I'm going to show a situation where the non-optimized code behaves differently than the optimized code for COBOL 6.4. This is dinosaur parkour, faster, better mainframe programming. I originally encountered this when doing initial testing with COBOL 5.1 in late 2013, early 2014. In this video, COBOL 6.4 is going to be new. The same program is going to be compiled 4 different ways. COBOL 4.2 not optimized, COBOL 4.2 optimized, COBOL 6.4 not optimized, and COBOL 6.4 optimized. The input record is 80 bytes long. The first bytes are defined as PIC95, which is an unsigned zone decimal. The same data is going to be read by each of the 4 test programs. A 5-digit zone decimal 0 for record 1. Record 2 is 0 space 0, and the last record is 5 spaces. Record 1 is a valid zone decimal value, and records 2 and 3 are invalid value. Before showing the results, let's take a quick look at the code. Line 23 tells which version of the program is running. Line 25 performs the paragraph to convert the zone decimal field into its displayable hex value. Line 27 displays the record number, the value of the zone decimal field, and its hex value. Line 29 to 31 tells us if the zone decimal is numeric or not. Line 32 to 36 tells us if the value is 0 or not. Since only record 1 is a valid 0 value, only the first record should tell us that the value is numeric and has a value of 0. It is time to review the result. COBOL 4.2 not optimized. Record 1 is numeric and 0. Records 2 and 3 are not numeric and are not equal to 0. Optimized COBOL 4.2 gets the same result. Record 1 is numeric and 0. The other 2 are not. Looking good so far. COBOL 6.4 opt 0, which means the code is not optimized. Record 2 and 3 are equal to 0. The numeric test still states that the zone decimal values are not numeric, but the if zone decimal equals 0 statement says the 0 plus 3 spaces plus a 0 and the 5 spaces are equal to 0. Pretty wild. How does the optimized COBOL 6.4 program behave? Fully optimized COBOL 6.4 code states that records 2 and 3 are not equal to 0. So optimized COBOL 6.4 behaves like COBOL 4.2. During the early days of COBOL 5.1, I attempted to report this issue, either this issue or one very similar. The procedure to open a ticket with IBM required me to document the issue and turn it over to the tech support person that installed COBOL. Basically, the issue was when a zone decimal field contains invalid numeric data such as spaces, opt0 compiler option causes the compiler to generate code that acts differently than optimized COBOL 5.1 code and differently than COBOL 4.2. The tech support person refused to create the ticket because invalid data was involved. You stupid programmers need to correct your bleep bleep data. I agreed that the data needed to be corrected, and it was. There was a major effort by the programming staff to identify and correct invalid data. My issue was that the same version of the compiler acted differently depending on the optimization level. This was and still is disconcerting even though the data is invalid. I am okay if code compiled using COBOL 6.4 act differently than code compiled with COBOL 4.2 when invalid data is involved. Invalid data creates unpredictable results. IBM warned their customer that the new compiler was likely to generate code that behaved differently than COBOL 4.2 when invalid data was involved. While I was more comfortable with 5.1 and higher compiler generating code that acts differently when invalid data is involved, IBM actually introduced the zone data and the invalid data compiler option to make COBOL 5 and 6 compilers behave more like COBOL 4.2 when invalid data is involved. Speaking of the act more like COBOL 4.2 option, we should see what happens when the invalid data option is used. Edit the program. Use op0 to turn off optimization. Add inv data to tell the compiler to generate the executable logic to behave like COBOL 4.2. The default for the invalid data option is no inv data. You should only turn on the invalid data option if you know you have invalid data. Save the changes. Enter make on the command line. Make is an edit macro I wrote which generates and submits to JCL to compile the program being edited. The program successfully compiled and I submitted a job to run the program. Here are the results. Now, the non-optimized COBOL 6.4 report that the invalid data is not equal to 0. Thus, this version of the program gets the same result as the non-optimized COBOL 4.2 version. While I was unsuccessful in reporting the issue, the fact that invalid data impacted the generated code for the non-optimized COBOL 6.4 implied that somebody else was successful. Am I happy with this? Yes and no. In my prior shop, the decision was to turn on the invalid data option, which at the time was zone data. That told the 6.1 compiler to generate code to behave like COBOL 4.2. That meant that non-optimized and optimized code behaved similar to 4.2 when zone decimal fields contained spaces. Thus, the non-optimized and optimized COBOL 6 code behaved the same. That made me happy. That was one less issue to worry about when my company converted from COBOL 4.2 to 6.1. Because I knew that non-optimized code could act differently, I advised programmers to test and compile using op2 to get fully optimized executable, since that was what was used for production code. I suggested using op0 to turn off optimization if debugging tool could not handle the fully optimized code. Debugging tools sometimes have issues with fully optimized COBOL code. Another disadvantage to using op2 to compile a program being tested is that it takes more time and CPU. Thus, the disadvantages of op2 for all test compiles were compile times increased, more CPU was used to do the compiles, and sometimes the debugging tool might have issues with the optimized code. Even with those disadvantages, I thought it was safer to avoid using op2 for testing during the COBOL 4.2 to 6.1 migration. What does this mean to the average programmer using Enterprise COBOL 6? If you prefer doing the bulk of your development and testing using non-optimized compile, the final test should use optimized code. In other words, your final unit test should use the option used for the production compile. Sounds like a no-brainer, but that is easy to overlook.